Well, in deference to the number of people that are wanting to testify when we consider our resolutions, we're going to take Resolution 10-0841 to seek voter approval for bonds for improving transit services and accessibility for elderly and people with disabilities first, and we're going to have a presentation at this point from Carolyn Young, who's going to walk us through the measure. Thanks, Carolyn. You want to take it?
Neil may want to introduce this.
Well, I was just going to make a couple introductory comments. First of all, we were very obviously pleased that in 1990 the voters approved a bond measure for the West Side Light Rail project and have been investing in transit since then, and it's a great milestone that we're actually at the point where those bonds are about to be retired or paid off. But it does pose the question, would voters and property taxpayers be willing to continue that investment in transit for a new purpose? And the purpose is an increasingly critical need, I think, of our system, which is to really focus our service to be friendly and to remove barriers for people with disabilities and the elderly. So again, I wanted to introduce Carolyn Young, our Executive Director of Communications, to actually review with you the proposal that's in front of you and why we think that this is an urgent need for us to consider at this stage. Carolyn?
Thank you, Mr. President and board members. I'll ask you to direct your attention to the screen so we can give you just a little bit of background on this measure and how we would expend this investment in capital resources. First of all, the elderly population in our region is growing. The projections between 2005 and 2015 look like this. Washington County is expected to grow 52%, Clackamas County 48%, and Multnomah County 26%. But that's just the beginning. What's coming our way is being called the baby boom tsunami. The Woodstock generation is reaching retirement age. So what does this mean for our region? In 25 years, the elderly population of Clackamas County is expected to double. Washington County is expected to triple. And Multnomah County's elderly population is expected to quadruple. What does this mean for TriMet? Well, it means that we'll have a rapid growth in the demand for high-quality transportation for our elderly riders and for people with disabilities. These transportation options will be provided on TriMet's fixed route service and on our paratransit service. On fixed route, of course, we have MAX. It's a mix of high-floor and low-floor cars. And what that means is that on high-floor cars, there's stairs. On low-floor cars, you can easily board, quickly board through a ramp without the use of time-consuming curbside lifts. TriMet was the first system in the country to have low-floor cars, making the system easy and accessible. On the bus side, we also have a mix of high-floor and low-floor cars. We estimate that TriMet's fixed route service provides about 10 million rides a year for elderly and disabled passengers. But our older buses and the lack of access to stops present significant barriers to our ridership. First of all, we have an aging bus fleet. It's not just our older riders, it's not just our riders who are getting older, but our bus fleet is way overdue for retirement. We like to replace buses when they're about 15 or 16 years old, but because of our budget crisis, we haven't been able to buy new buses. We have more than 150 buses running on the street today that are 19 and even 20 years old, making TriMet's one of the oldest transit fleets in the country. In total, about half of our fleet presents significant barriers for frail elderly and people with disabilities because they have high floors, meaning riders need to climb stairs or ask for a lift to be deployed if they need it. These old lifts are very slow, and because they're old, they need frequent maintenance. Most of the older buses don't even kneel. They don't have air conditioning, which makes riding uncomfortable or even dangerous for frail passengers on warm days. And they don't have automatic stop announcements, which tell vision-impaired riders when to get off. Another major barrier, even more significant, is access to stops. This is a real barrier to riding our fixed route service, especially in the more rural areas. I'd like to show you a few examples of some stops that aren't accessible and some of the things in the physical environment that keep elderly people and people with disabilities from making better use of our fixed route system. Poor stop locations like this one has no safe place to stand and no place to deploy a lift for a rider in a mobility device. Another significant barrier is lack of crosswalks and crossing lights, especially on 4-lane roads and highways. A major barrier is lack of sidewalks. Many of our bus stops and even some of our MAX platforms are difficult or impossible to reach because there's no sidewalk connections. Even where a sidewalk exists, there's sometimes other barriers on the street. Imagine coming up to this if you're in a mobility device. No curb cuts are another problem. So sidewalks alone aren't enough, they have to have curb cuts. This is a nice signalized intersection, but if you're in a mobility device or even use a walker, how are you supposed to get to the button to request a pedestrian signal? Our other service is Lyft. When riders can't use our fixed route system, they turn to our paratransit system. Our Lyft service must comply with the Americans for Disability Act. Lyft uses a small fleet of buses, sedans, and sometimes taxi cabs to provide door-to-door service, making about 1.1 million trips a year. Lyft rides are scheduled in advance by reservation through our dispatch system. Several passengers share the Lyft vehicle and travel times could vary depending on distance and the number of stops made to accommodate other riders during the trip. TriMet works closely with the Citizen Advisory Committee on Accessible Transportation to seek ways to further improve our programs and services. Well, who uses Lyft? A large variety of people, including low-income individuals who can't afford a taxi, older drivers who are forced to give up their driving privileges, frail elderly and people with disabilities who can't access fixed route stops and our buses. The Lyft provides an essential service that allows a fast expanding number of citizens to fully participate in society. Lyft provides access to jobs, to medical appointments such as dialysis and other critical care, shopping for food and clothing, recreation, religious services, or just visiting friends. For thousands of people in our community, Lyft service is vital for productivity and independence. But because of this type of individualized door-to-door service, it's expensive and the cost is growing. Since the enactment of the ADA in 1991, TriMet's costs have increased 475%. Of the $31 million that's spent on Lyft every year, about 80% comes from the general fund. And because of the growing demand for Lyft service, the costs are expected to increase around 7.5% to 12% a year in the future. How does this compare to our fixed route service? Well, bus and MAX cost an average of $2.75 a ride, while Lyft costs about $29 a ride because of that individualized nature of the service. Because of the rising costs and declining revenues that we face in our budget right now, we're falling behind in providing quality service. For example, the expected life of a Lyft bus is about 7 to 8 years. But because of our budget shortfall, we're keeping these vehicles much longer. 10% of our fleet of 267 buses is over 11 years old. By the time we have enough money in our budget forecast to replace these buses, they'll have driven more than 400,000 miles. That's much longer than the 150,000 miles that buses were driving just a few years ago. To keep up with the growth in elderly population, we'll need to expand the number of vehicles along with the number of operators and dispatchers. The bottom line is that to continue to provide quality service in the future, we'll be forced to make further cuts in other areas or find a new source of revenue. And that's why you have a resolution in front of you today for a ballot measure. This proposal would place a measure on the November ballot that would continue a property tax levy for TriMet. The existing TriMet levy, which was issued for West Side Light Rail, will soon expire. The new measure would replace it at approximately the same rate without an increase in current taxes. The current rate is a little over $8 per 100,000 in valuation. That's about $17 for a $200,000 house, or about $25 a year for a $300,000 house. The measure would generate $125 million. What would we do with these new financial resources? Well, the additional money could be used to replace and expand lift vehicle fleet. It could remove physical barriers to transit stops, and it could replace aging buses. The additional financial resources will allow us to replace these out-of-date buses and buy new buses to meet the increasing demand. It would also enable us to replace our out-of-date lift dispatch and radio system. A key component of that new system is a modern mobile data terminal that's similar to the onboard terminals you've seen in taxis and emergency vehicles. These terminals provide up-to-date information on routes, schedules, the manifest that the operators carry. They show maps and even can tell the operator how to avoid traffic congestion. The result would be faster, more reliable service with reduced wait time, making it more efficient for TriMet's bottom line. In total, we could allocate up to about 15% of the revenue to lift improvements. We could also improve the accessibility of hundreds of transit stops. I'd like to show you a few examples. With additional resources, we can transform a stop that's not accessible from this to this, from this to this, from this to this. We can even take a stop that's in a ditch and transform it to a stop like this that includes a sidewalk, pad, shelter, customer information, and a new bus stop sign. We could also use the money for other improvements that could improve safety and security, such as solar lighting. Here's another example of an improved stop and shelter. This is the shelter, old shelter on 82nd Avenue at the intersection with Max. It's one of the busiest stops in our entire system. It was dark at night, the shelter was crowded, and our riders said they often didn't feel safe. With the new shelter design and solar lighting, the stop could be transformed into a safe and comfortable place to wait. We could allocate up to 20% of the bond revenue for improvements such as this throughout the system. And finally, we could replace some of our old out-of-date buses, transferring some of these old high-floor buses from this to this. New modern buses with air conditioning, low floors for easy access, and automatic stop announcements. We could allocate up to 70% of the revenue for bus replacements. With new revenue, we'd not only be able to buy new buses, without new revenue, we would not be able to start replacing these buses until 2012. Under our current budget forecast, we'd have buses that were 24 years old before they reach replacement. So in the end, everybody wins. When stops are improved, when new buses are added and costs are decreased, it helps every rider. So that concludes my presentation, and turn it back to Michelle.